Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Debra, and this is Human Potential at Work. I'm the CEO of RU Global Impact, and today I have somebody that I consider a friend on, but I've known her for many years. I've admired her for many years, and it's just staggering what she has done for our community, both in the United States and globally. And she's going to be all, oh, it's no big deal. But I mean, seriously, what she has done is definitely changed the world. Just a few things that she's done. She was she created, along with others, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act of 2010. She was instrumental in that. She also was instrumental in making sure that we had the right kind of legislative language to make sure that with the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 255 and 713 of the Communications Act, that companies were actually following our laws. And then she helped support the National Deaf Blind Equipment Distribution program. So those right now just sound like words, but we're going to talk about them a little bit more, because what she has done is single-handedly, once again, with a lot of support from others, really changed the world to make sure communications are fully accessible. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. She's retired from the FCC and she's doing really cool things now. And I want to welcome Karen Peltz Strauss to the program today. I have been nagging and bugging her to be on the show for many years, and she finally agreed to do it during the lockdown. So Karen, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Debra. It's really a delight to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I know that you're modest and you don't like bragging about all the amazing things that you've done, but it's just, I mean, it's great that we create laws, but we actually have to make sure that we all comply and utilize these laws. And that is a big thing that you've done. And when we think about communications, and I actually took a little note so I would try to capture them all. We're talking about communications from all these different ways. So hearing aid compatibility, because in the early days before Karen and other leaders stepped up, the cell phones didn't work with the hearing aids, and then other things as well. Having access to emergency services. We put out an emergency message saying, there's a tornado in your area, but we don't caption it. Well, I guess it's just too bad if you're deaf or hard of hearing where you can't hear what's being said. Real-time texting, access to multimedia. Now think about multimedia, that's video and audio, it's Zoom, it's everything we're doing during this pandemic. Open and closed captions, relay services. She has done so much. She's beloved by the community. And she's been very gracious all during her career. I know, I'm sorry, Karen, but you deserve all this love and accolades. I was reading a letter about her being a stellar public servant by Michael Copps, which was one of the commissioners of the FCC. And it really brought tears to my eyes. It was so beautiful. So she's very understated, and she won't want to brag about herself. So I just had to do that. But Karen, tell us more about how it started. Tell us about, just tell us about your journey, because you've changed the world. And I thank you for that.
Well, you are so sweet and so kind. Thank you very much. That's such an overwhelming and very inspiring for me introduction. I want to say from the start that I did not do this on my own, that I had guidance all the way, I had support all the way, and so much of this is owing to a movement that's so much larger than I am. And I just feel lucky, and I've said this many times, to have been in the right place at the right time and fit into a slot that was both fun in many ways and challenging to fit into. I saw a need, I filled it, but it was certainly not done in isolation. I'm going to go way back just really quickly. I grew up in a family with very progressive parents who saw social injustices. Disability issues were not in my family growing up. I saw things as a child. I saw children across the street who had deaf parents who were made fun of because of their deaf parents, but it was not in my family. When I went to law school, I went for the purpose of actually working on mental health issues. We did have mental health issues in our family, not immediate, but my extended family. And I was always very sensitive to discrimination against people based on their differences in their emotional capabilities of dealing with society. And so I actually went to law school thinking that I was going to work on the legal rights of people with mental disabilities and emotional disabilities. When I got out of law school, I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I worked for a small entity called the Institute for Public Representation, which was part of Georgetown University's law center. It was a clinic. And I got involved in physical disabilities. I got involved in issues on making sure that polling places were accessible, and actually worked then on a bill called the Voting Rights for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. It shows you how old I am, that's the wording that we use. And I got to know a lot of the people in the deaf community, in the blind community, people like Nancy Block at National Association of the Deaf, people like Scott Marshall, people like Paul Marchand at the ARC. I mean, I could just go down the list of names of people that Reese Robrand from ACCD. I mean, these were really people that were right there in front and center at the beginning. And I worked closely also with Ralph Neese to make sure that polling places in federal elections were accessible. After that, I tried to get a job actually at the Bazelon Center on working on mental health issues, and there were none. And so I went to the government for 2 years and then did not enjoy that. Was then hired by the National Center for Law and the Deaf at Gallaudet University. I knew no sign language, not a stitch, but I did know some of the issues because I had worked on them at Georgetown, and they hired me. And that was the beginning of my legal career in disability access. And Al Sonnenstrahl in the deaf community taught me everything that I needed to know to work on legal issues addressing people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And what's interesting is that we were a small office. We only had around 6 attorneys. And everybody else took what they thought were the juicy issues, education and housing and healthcare and employment. And they gave me this thin folder on telecommunications, which in 1988, which is when I started working there, was not very exciting. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of got the leftover. I also had worked on some telecom issues at Georgetown, not related to disability. And then things started to snowball. And then as time went on, again, 1988 and 1989, we started working on the ADA, on telecommunications relay services. 1988 was the Deaf President Now movement. Actually, I'm sorry, I started working there in 1984, not 1988. In 1988 was the Deaf President Now movement. Things started moving in Congress. Mm-hmm. You mentioned hearing incompatibility, relay services, federal relay services, and then again, or nationwide relay services. And then we just, again, we were there. So it wasn't only it was I with other people in our office, and we put together language and it went forward. Gallaudet closed our law center. We were on the campus of Gallaudet University. They closed us in 1996. So I moved over to the National Association of the Deaf for a few years before I was asked to come into the Federal Communications Commission as the first deputy chief of their new consumer bureau that would house a division dedicated to disability rights. And so I stayed there. That was invited in by the Clinton administration. I stayed there for 2 years, and then I left, went out, wrote another law, the CVAA, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, wrote a book, and did consulting. And then when Obama came back, I went back in, this time stayed for close to 9 years, and then came out. And so as you pointed out, I am officially retired from the FCC, but I'm not officially retired from these issues.
Yes, and you know, it just shows what one person can do. And once again, I agree. We don't ever do it alone, but writing these laws, these were a really big deal, and really standing beside and with these communities. And sometimes these communities, they don't come, in the past, they didn't come together as well. So you had the blind, you know, focusing on helping people that were blind, you had deaf, supporting people that are deaf. And then you really helped bring these two groups together. And then of course there's the deaf blind. So, and we've talked about that on the show before, but I remember talking to people globally about the 21st Century Act, and they were saying, we need something like that. We don't, I remember talking about it in Oman, and they were saying, we don't know how to do that. We can't get our television stations to caption. And it's, you know, it's, I have an ICT, internet communications, telecommunications background. Internet communications and technology, but a telecommunications background as well. And it is so important, as we know, Karen, because yes, we need to make sure our websites are accessible. Yes, our apps need to be accessible. But if our communications and our connectivity is not accessible, then you can't really use the technology. And of course, we've seen the byproduct of this as we've all gone home, sheltering in place, stay safe from the pandemic. Connectivity, and now as a world, we're talking about 5G. And it's fascinating, some of the conspiracy theories about 5G. It gave us all the COVID-19. It's like really interesting, but it seems like every time as we try to move forward with communications, there's a lot of controversy and a lot of interesting, you know, theories, and sometimes real rat holes. But you were the leader that I saw really stepping in to make sure that corporations were actually complying with our laws, and that they understood that, yeah, we have these different laws, but including, as you were mentioning, voting, you know, and we're coming up on a very important election in the United States in November, and people are afraid to go out to vote. So having accessible polling places, as I always say, accessibility is not just for people with disabilities, it's for all of us. So tell us more about, I mean, because this is very complicated. There's so many moving parts. How in the world did you orchestrate this?
Well, again, I didn't do it by myself. With respect, I guess each law had its own progression. The 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, the CVAA, is the most recent one. So why don't I take that one? It was very interesting. Around 2000, this year 2000, things obviously started to change. The internet was starting to gain momentum. And those of us working in the disability field realized how many times in the past people with disabilities were left behind when new technologies were introduced. The telephone, TV, it took literally decades to bring people with disabilities into the fold. And so, like I said, decades were lost in terms of access to these technologies. And so we went to Congress. In 2005, I went to Congressman Markey, who at that time was in the House, and he was our go-to for every single one of these bills. And I said, we need another bill. And he said, okay, as he always did. And he got me onto there was a hearing that was taking place, but we didn't have a bill. But I got to speak to Congress about the issue. And I realized, see, this is why I say I didn't do it myself. I thought I could maybe do it myself, just a little bit. No, 2 years went by and I said, you know what? I can't do this myself. I need a coalition. This is too monumental. What we need is a bill to bring all of the laws that we got passed, enacted, again, closed captioning, hearing aid compatibility, relay services, communications equipment. We need all of those to be brought up to date to wireless, digital, and other evolving technologies, internet-based technologies. And so we formed a coalition, the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology, nicknamed COAT. And what I realized, and we were around 10 organizations that started this. A lot of the main disability organizations, the National Association of the Deaf, Telecommunications for the Deaf, American Council of the Blind, American Foundation. I'm going to get the ofs and the fours mixed up, but I think American Foundation for the Blind and various others, also American Association of People with Disabilities. We formed this coalition and we sent out, everybody sent out letters, emails, and to other organizations. And within like weeks, we had 30 organizations. Then within a few more weeks, we had 60 organizations. And then all of a sudden, before we knew it, we had 300 local, regional, and national organizations. We had hit a nerve. And basically our mantra was, let's not be left behind again. People were already seeing new technologies coming out, leaving them behind. And so this is why, again, I say that this was a monumental effort. We had a steering committee of around 5. One person became the expert on social media. Another one did the web. Another one did the lobbying. I was the drafter. It was really a coordinated effort. And it took 3 years. The law was passed in 2010. We were very lucky that the 20th anniversary of the ADA was coming up. Nancy Pelosi pushed it through under that theory, and it eventually passed with unanimous consent. Yeah. But I also wanted to point out, you mentioned something earlier that definitely hit home, and that is that without these laws, it terrifies me. It scares me so much to think where people with disabilities would be with respect to COVID right now, because these are the laws that have connected people. Without these laws, people would not, I mean, we're all watching a lot more TV than we've probably ever watched. This is our evening entertainment. Where else are we going to go? They would not have access to that. They would not be able to make telephone calls. They would not be able to access the web. It's just, again, this was a monumental effort by a lot of people who said, we will not stand for not having access. And the legislators, people like Markey, originally Senator McCain, and various others on the Hill that provided support were very instrumental to making this happen.
Yes, and I think
Arkansas, Senator Pryor as well.
Right. And I believe Markey's seat is up, and so he's fighting for his seat. I hope that we remember as a community what he has done for us, because we need these leaders. We need these leaders that are supporting us, and they have proven that they will support us. So I hope that he retains his
op-ed that has been published in Metro West, a newsletter. I don't know if that could be shared, a newspaper in Massachusetts.
Yes. Please send me the link, and I will make sure that we include that for the audience. So please send me that link.
Great.
Yeah, because we've got to fight for the ones that fight for us. We have to. And if you don't include us, we are also going to notice that, and we're going to make sure we fight for your competitor. So it's very important. And I see more politicians really starting to take this more seriously. Karen, I recently wrote an article about voice technologies and how our community, the community of people with disabilities and people that are aging into disabilities, how critical these voice technologies are. And now there's legislation popping up that could actually stop these technologies from learning. And I know we all worry, as do I, about privacy issues and using our data improperly, which, by the way, we've seen over and over and over again. I mean, it was actually being discussed before Congress yesterday. So these are real issues, but at the same time, if we don't allow these technologies to learn, then they are not as powerful. And if you actually take away their ability to learn, you actually are going to hurt our community. So this is right in your wheelhouse. I mean, this is, once again, technology and communications coming together. They must work together. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, exploring that topic a little bit.
Sure. I'm not familiar. I have to read your article, so I think it's going to educate me more about this particular issue. But the one point that resonates the most is the need for redundancy in technology. Whenever something is provided in an audio format, it should be provided in a visual format, and vice versa. And that is to make sure to ensure the full inclusion of everybody who needs access to that technology. So voice technologies have enabled people who are blind and visually impaired to interact with their TVs. I mean, there was a whole period where people who could not see could not do simple things like change a channel, find a program, record a program, turn the volume up and down. I mean, any interface with the television was through flat screens and that did not talk back to you and did not tell you what you were doing. Cell phones, obviously, when they first came out, when the iPhone and other flat screen phones came out, they were completely inaccessible. So that kind of voice technology, also automated speech recognition technologies, are bringing about huge changes for people with disabilities. We have to be careful not to rely on them too much as a substitute for captioning just yet. They're getting a lot more accurate, but they're not quite there. But everything contributes to providing accessibility. Nothing should be excluded. Everything should be an option to make sure that formats are accessible for the varied types of disability, people with disabilities that need to use them.
I agree. And that's why, once again, your work and your leadership and pulling people together has been so critical. And I know now, more and more we're using artificial intelligence. And as you said, it can't be a replacement for captioning, because captioning supports all of us. We know this. We know studies from Verizon and Facebook have told us that 80 to 85% of users watch your videos with the sound turned off. So I hope your video is telling us everything we need if you have chosen not to caption, because you're going to lose your audience. And I see, I have investors call me sometimes and ask my opinion of, what they should be investing in. And I recently had 2 different investor calls where they were talking about they wanted to solve this captioning problem all with AI, artificial intelligence. And I said, we're just not there yet. So what we can't do is, as we're getting there, take away what we already have, because it hurts way too many people. Way too many people need things to be fully accessible. But at the time when we were all focused on the Section 508, in my old past when I had my company Tech Access, we weren't really talking about the communications aspect of it, even though it was so critical. So Karen, why did you know that this had to be addressed? I mean, because a lot of people weren't paying attention to it. And certainly once you started talking about it, because I remember I started getting really engaged in the conversations when you started talking about it, but why did you even know to take these steps and to start protecting our communities?
So I've always been, again, I haven't done things in a vacuum. It's not like I sat in my house and thought, there's a problem out there. I've been in communication with people constantly. And so everything that's in the CVAA and in every other law, I may have drafted it, but I didn't necessarily think it up. Some of the things I did, but most often there were concepts and approaches that were provided to me. So I would talk to the community. First of all, I had been involved in this for years and years, and I saw the technology changing. And I mean, it's kind of obvious that if the technology is changing, you need to address the new technologies. It's happening again.
Yes.
With artificial intelligence and virtual reality and augmented reality. And we're in the so-called 4th industrial revolution that's going to be dramatically changing our lives on a daily basis. So you can see it coming. If you've been involved in this area, you can say it's just obvious that if protections aren't in place, there will be problems. We had seen it so many times before. Again, the television, not accessible for the first 50 years. The telephone, not accessible for the first 100 years. Digital wireless phones, not accessible for the first 10 years. Analog phones were, not hearing compatible, that is. And I watched my friends, my colleagues, not being able to use digital phones. I had this nice, sleek, flat phone, while my friend with a hearing aid was using a massive
Speaking of phones.
I should probably get rid of that. 1 second, I'm just going to turn this off, and that way that won't happen. was using one of those massive analog phones that
Right.
that cost a lot and
Mhm.
wasn't bundled with any other services, and it just was obviously wrong to me. But again, the actual language, like, it wasn't my idea, for example, to necessarily address all of the things that we've addressed in the video programming section of the CVAA, all of the flat screen issues. Those came from ACB and AFB and other colleagues that said, this is what we need here, this is what we need there. And then I took that and drafted it. So I didn't do it out of thin air. Some of the issues I was familiar with, just having been involved in these issues, but I worked with the communities every step of the way. And it's interesting because, you know, some people have said, you know, I don't have a disability, so how am I involved in this? Well, I don't have a disability yet,
Right.
but there's a couple of things. First of all, I use captioning just as much as everybody else. I find that it helps me with processing. I
Mhm.
also have a mild hearing loss that it helps me hear. And I now have children and grandchildren that have disabilities. So there are different levels of disabilities in terms of how they affect their daily affairs. But if you wait long enough, there will be somebody in your life, either in your immediate family or otherwise, that needs these various accommodations. So I've joked with people, but I've said I did it for myself.
Right. Right. And you know, somebody has benefited from it because my daughter born with Down syndrome benefited from these efforts, but so did my husband, who is aged into dementia. And I was thinking about even things that people they don't think about, you know, the interacting with the television, you know, the remote controls and stuff. And I remember when my mother, who didn't have dementia, but she had a very, very serious diabetes, it's brittle diabetes. It's very, very difficult. And she passed away from it. But I remember when she moved into Richmond, Virginia, and she got Comcast, and the guy that came in to install it was so proud. He's like, oh, look what we did for that are blind. My mom wasn't blind, but she was elderly, and he was showing her everything it could do. You could talk to the remote, and it just was so valuable to my mother. And then my husband, he got to the point where he just could not, like you said, he couldn't change the channels and things like that. And so I was like, yeah, but that's really cool because you can just speak to the remote control now and just ask the remote control. Now his communications has gotten worse, so he can't do that anymore, but that's okay. So I just think it is embedded in so many things and people don't realize it. But I do want to just talk for a second, Karen. I mean, we're really blessed. Some people might not think so right now, looking outside, looking in the US, it seems really terrifying over here, but we are blessed to live in the United States, and with our laws and our litigation and us holding each other accountable. And, you know, one thing I love about Americans is we will fight for each other. You know, we sometimes do it very messy, but we really, as a whole, I think most Americans really care about these issues. And I know our corporations have really stepped up on these things, but I look at other countries that don't have laws like this. And once again, I have heard from countries saying, we wish we had a Karen, we wish we had Karen here. But, you know, and it's always so beautiful that other countries use our legislation, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was, you know, very, very catalytic when it came to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They, you know, a lot of the language, you know, was used. And so how do we help globally when other countries don't have laws like this?
So I have done a fair amount of sharing information with other countries. We're lucky to have Axel Lebois and G3 ICT and his annual MEnabling conference. I'm not sure what's happening to it this year, but that conference, as you know, has brought together hundreds of people, thousands over the years, tens of thousands probably, to learn from to exchange ideas, not only learn from us, we've learned from some other countries. We're pretty far ahead, but a couple of countries have beat us, especially in the audio description category. And it's been very helpful to have that inter-exchange. And he actually brought MEnabling over to other countries. And
Yes.
we did events in Russia, Milan, Australia, and he's done many others in addition to that. Those are the only ones I participated, but I've given presentations to Mexico and to ITU in Geneva and various other locations. So there's also something called the Accessible Americas series of conferences. I don't know if you're familiar with those. And we participated in those for about 4 years. Brazil, I'm forgetting, I think Ecuador, but I'm not sure. Colombia, definitely, Mexico. And so what we try to do as much as we can is just give information, provide information about how we've done it. We met with the Canadian minister on accessibility issues when they were drafting their law. We have done a lot, so we think it's helpful to have them start from where we provided guidance, and then instead of completely reinventing the wheel, maybe build off of that. I know that now Gallaudet has a project with Nigeria, and I've talked to them about possibly getting involved in that. It's endless, the opportunities to share our information with others in other countries. I do feel like we've been very lucky here in being able to make the progress that we have had, and am interested in the coming years in sharing this more and more with other countries. It's a little bit more challenging now that travel is a challenge, but we can still do a lot over venues like this.
Yes, and I know that the MEnabling is going to go virtual this year because it has no choice. It's usually in June, but this year it'll be in September. And then, you know, they're trying to be very careful, obviously, to make sure everybody's safe. So they're going to go virtual, and it's in the middle of September. But I agree with you. I always learn so much from that conference. We're always there. We're always supporting what they do. G3ICT actually was one of the publishers of my book. I'm a big fan of what they do and how they do what you're doing, Karen. They collaborate, they bring everybody together. And I loved how, G3ICT at the MEnabling would always bring in the FCC to have these, I learned so much from those efforts. And so
started with the FCC. We were there for a sponsor. They came to us and said Axel did, he had this idea, and Pam Gregory, who was at the FCC at the time, welcomed him and introduced me, and it went on from that. But yeah, the FCC was a co-sponsor of that event for many, many years, and it was a pleasure to do it. And the FCC's Chairman's Awards in accessibility are hosted every year, or at least have been in the past, at MEnabling, which was really fun to be able to, I don't know, for those of you who don't know about those awards, they recognize innovations in accessible technology. And while they sometimes recognize larger companies, a lot of times they recognize startups or smaller companies that have been very innovative in how to provide accessibility.
Yeah, I always enjoyed that part of it because I always learned so much. And I always, like you, I always love learning. So, what are you worried about with the future? I mean, what are you seeing with the gaps? I mean, we both mentioned artificial intelligence and the new, the wearables and all the new technologies, the IoT and things like that. But, what do you mentioned a little bit, but I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about the gaps in the future.
Yeah, and there's just so much going on. It's hard to get one's head around it. Last year I attended CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and it was, well, if you've ever gone there, it's overwhelming just to even be there. But the breadth of technologies is just endless. Everything from being able to monitor people with disabilities and assist them from remote locations, monitoring senior citizens who live alone or older people who live alone, to make sure that they're taking the right medicine and able to travel around independently, and all kinds of life activities, being able to monitor those remotely. The one thing that I tell you did concern me was the use of AI as a predictor. There's been a lot of discussion about this and the algorithms that are used, and whether or not those algorithms are going to be discriminatory against people with disabilities, especially if they're used to determine who is qualified for employment and education and other purposes like that. Another concern is privacy. There was one session that I went to. Basically, there was a monitor in your home that basically is monitoring everything that you're doing. And it was couched in terms of helping like daily activities, like starting the stove while you're still driving home, the oven rather, while you're still driving home, which I wasn't quite sure why they were saying that, but again, predictive analysis of what you should be doing. And I'm not sure that I feel comfortable having that level of invasiveness in my life. So, and then there's just general concerns about connectivity and being able to access the new types of technologies. One of the kiosks we saw was a standalone, basically market out on the street, and you could select products from it, except that it was completely inaccessible. And so I asked, well, is there voice output, audio output? And it was clear that the manufacturer or its representative had not thought about that, but actually was interested in thinking about it and said they were going to take it back. It's that kind of repeated push that we've had to do for years and years and years. Just think ahead and don't move ahead with design and development until you have incorporated the needs of people with accessibility. And that is, needs of people with disabilities. That's what worries me the most. That's what keeps me awake at night, so to speak, whether or not as these new technologies come into play, there will be people at the front end making sure that they are accessible. Everything from gaming to, again, our house appliances to our cars, autonomous cars, okay? That will revolutionize society, and it will bring so many benefits. All of these technologies can bring so many benefits to people with disabilities, but not if those cars are not accessible. And a lot of issues with those cars potentially not being accessible. You have to be able, if you're a blind person and you want to be able to use that car, you have to have full accessibility to be able to use that car.
Right. It's been interesting, some of the studies I've seen where the cars get a little confused by wheelchair users in the crosswalk, and there's a lot of work to do. Karen, this might put you on a little on the spot. Hopefully it won't. But so you've retired for the FCC. I would like to hope, and I don't know this, but they hopefully replaced you with somebody that is going to carry out this work, because I mean the FCC has been so committed for so long, but I just don't know that. I probably should have asked you that off air. So if you're comfortable, addressing it.
I will say that I think that I stayed at the FCC after the last election. I don't want to get too political, but even though I was brought in by the Democratic administration, I stayed. Chairman Pai had, and he's mentioned this publicly, he had a deaf aunt, and he was very willing to continue the movement, so to speak, or to continue addressing these issues during the last 2 years that I was there, both of which were after the 2016 election. Two very major regulations were adopted. One requiring volume control on wireless phones, a specific volume control standard, and the other expanding the requirements for video description, and they've since been expanded, or they're being proposed to be expanded again. Disability does not have to be a partisan issue. It never was. I mean, I think that frankly, we did make more gains, a few more gains in Democratic administrations, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I worked very closely, as I mentioned earlier on, with Senator McCain when he was alive. He was our champion on the Senate when Markey was our champion in the House. And of course, there were many other senators, Dole and Hatch and various others who worked very hard on the ADA, as well as on the 1996 amendments to the Communications Act, which brought us closed captioning and Section 255, which is access to telecommunications products and equipment and services, rather. I personally think that the Biden administration will be able to bring us more in terms of progressive change. These administrations have always been very willing to address the needs of people with disabilities without as much concern about the cost burden, understanding that it is a right, not a privilege, and it's not a burden. It's actually a benefit, because you pointed out that when you design for accessibility, even if you're designing for a particular disability, chances are many other people are going to be able to benefit from that. And the quintessential curb cut that's used for not only wheelchairs, but strollers and carts and bicycles, closed captioning, which isn't only used for people who are deaf, but rather people who are in bars and restaurants, as well as have cognitive disabilities and need the extra processing. Even things like talking, what is it called? When
the avatars?
Not avatars, but when you're, I'm trying to remember what it's called, when a telephone calls in, talking caller ID.
Okay.
Which alerts hearing people if they're sitting in a different room that a call is coming in. There's just so many ways that providing accessibility benefits everybody. And I think that I'm hopeful that there are people at the FCC that will still carry this on. I do believe that there are. And I also remember that the head of the Disability Rights Office is a deaf woman named Susie Rosen-Singleton. Right. And she is certainly a very staunch
she's amazing.
Of the issues, and all of the people in the Disability Rights Office are dedicated to these issues, as I think is the leadership of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. So I had no trouble when I was there the last 2 years. Again, I personally think that the Biden administration is the way to go. That's just my personal preference, but I do think that these issues don't have to be bipartisan issues.
I agree. And Bush Sr. signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. So it is not bipartisan. But what we do know, and this is sort of sad to say, but we have to continue to pay attention to this at a legislative level, because corporations, and it's not just corporations, but technology developers, they keep forgetting this stuff. And like you mentioned, the unconscious bias, and we can't take our hands off the wheel. We still all have to come together, which is why we have these conversations. But I know I could talk to you all day. And certainly, once again, sometimes I think society doesn't realize how much all of these things are connected, like the, accessible voting, which we all need. Right. So they're very complex topics. And go ahead.
One other thing. I want to give kudos to those companies, and there are many of them now, that have, as I like to say, reached a tipping point. Years ago, it was a matter of retrofitting a big black box hardware phone, and now it's not. Two people could have the same device and personalize it, customize it to make it address their individual accessibility needs. And I think because of the changes in technology, coupled with more of a willingness to address the needs of people with disabilities, we have seen a sea change in how much is accessible. And companies, I hesitate to name some of them because I'm going to leave some of them out, but some of the big companies, the big IT companies, have been remarkable in providing accessibility. And these are telecom companies as well. Many of them have gone far beyond what the law requires. And it's very encouraging and inspiring to see the leaders of these efforts, many of whom happen to be women, actually, move forward with their agendas. Their disability agendas they have huge accessibility teams that examine their products and design with accessibility features incorporated into their products and services. So I do think that we do need policies, but I'm very encouraged by the fact that so many of these companies have stepped forward to make these changes, often on their own, even without the policies behind them.
I agree. And also, they're hiring very, very talented technologists and telecommunication experts that have disabilities. I mean, they have taken the best talent off of the streets because right now, if you're a person with a disability that knows how to do this stuff, you are real sought after. So that's exciting too. Right. It benefits our community. So I know we're out of time, Karen, but tell us how people can get in touch with you and sort of what are your hopes for the future?
So I am on LinkedIn and feel free to reach me there. My immediate hope for the future is that our November elections bring a little bit more sanity to our country. But I also hope, again, that as we move forward, we have a place at the table, at the technological table, so that, and again, I do think that we have one right now, and so I hope that we continue to have one, especially as new entrants come onto the scene that are not familiar with what we've done. Just like when the IT entrants came on, they were not familiar with what we had done in telecom. So I'm not sure what they're going to call it in the future, but whoever is coming on board, I hope that we have an opportunity to be part of the process, that we have a voice in what's happening. And one other thing, some of us are older. My hope for the future is that we can pass the baton to the younger generation. I'm not ready to give up yet. I'm only retired from the FCC. I'm not retired from this, but I do hope that we see more and more younger people taking on this mantle.
Well said, well said. Karen, thank you so much for your years and years of leadership, your ongoing leadership. I think you should be very proud of what you've accomplished. Once again, no, you didn't do it in a vacuum. So many amazing other people, joined you in these efforts, but you really have shown major leadership, and we're so grateful for you.
I really appreciate the kind words, but right back at you, Debra. You've been extraordinary, and I wish that I could have the opportunity to do to you what you just did to me, because your amazing innovation and your amazing advocacy has made a world of a difference to this community and continues to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a labor of love, the work that we get to do. So, well, thank you to the audience, and we will make sure that we get a copy of her op-ed piece, and we'll make sure that you have a link for that, and you'll be able to find this video on YouTube, Facebook, all over social media, and of course it'll be fully captioned because we want to walk the walk. So thank you to the audience, and Karen, thank you for all you're doing, and I look forward to seeing you in person someday soon.
Same here. I hope.
Bye, everyone.